Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History's Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium of the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And if you've not already done so, please silence your cell phones. Those of you joining us in person saw the museum's beautiful holiday decorations. We'll have the holiday open house this Saturday, November 20th from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. And we'll feature book signings, food and beverage samples, artist and maker meet and greets, and holiday specials at the Mississippi Museum Store. And circle Friday, December 3rd on your calendars. From 4 to 8 p.m. that day, we'll have our Christmas by Candlelight tour. See the decorated Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, the State Capitol, Governor's Mansion, and the grounds of the Old Capitol Museum. This would traditionally be our last History's Lunch of the season. This year we'll have one more. I hope you'll join us on Wednesday, December 8th, when Robert Kayat will discuss his new book, 60, A Year of Sports, Race, and Politics. Today we are delighted to welcome scholar, author, historian, and preservationist Alferdteen Harrison to discuss midwives in Mississippi history. Alferdteen Brown Harrison earned her B.A. from McPherson College, her M.A. from Wichita State University, and her Ph.D. in history from the University of Kansas, where she is a member of that institution's Women's Hall of Fame. Harrison is a former professor and director of the Margaret Walker Center at Jackson State University and the co-founder of Smith Robertson Museum and Cultural Center in Jackson. She is a co-founder of the Mississippi Heritage Trust and a former president of the Mississippi Historical Society. Harrison is the author of A History of the Most Worshipful Stringer Grand Lodge and Piney Woods School and Oral History. She's also an alumnus of that school. And editor of Black Exodus, The Great Migration from the American South. This year, Harrison received the Mississippi Historical Society's Lifetime Achievement Award and the Richard Wright Award from the Natchez Literary and Cinema Celebration, and was honorary chair of the Mississippi Heritage Trust's announcement of the 10 most endangered historic places in Mississippi. Harrison is executive director of Scott Ford Houses Incorporated, a group that aims to transform the houses into a museum that will pay homage to Mississippi's midwives and chronicle their accomplishments. Before we bring Dr. Harrison to stage, we'll play a video about the Scott Ford houses, the families that built them and lived in them.
I've been driven ever since I was a child to understand African American culture. So the search for how to preserve my people's culture and how to tell the story became a lifetime commitment. I used to take my sons to all my professional meetings, the American Historical, the National Trust, and so forth. One day, Malcolm, being the inquisitive person, said, "Mom, we're tired of going to those white folks' homes. Aren't there any black historic homes?" So I think our black kids are growing up in a culture where they don't get to see positive images of themselves reflected in history. There's a whole story, and it's the Ferris Street Historic District that we are tearing down, where black people built a very positive life. Most of the civil rights workers who came early stayed in homes and worked there. The NAACP's first office was in the same building as the Big Apple Inn. You know, there's a biblical story about saving stones to remember where we came from. So those Farish Street homes are the stepping stones for the civil rights movement. We didn't just come out of slavery and do nothing. We actually built wholesome communities with all the parallel institutions that existed in the white community. So sure, there was segregation, but within segregation, African Americans were very creative. And that's what Farish Street was. When it was listed on the National Register, it was one of the best preserved African American communities for the period. We still have some opportunities in the Ferris Street Historic District. It was Lula Ford's daughter, Dorothy Dobbins, who deeded the Scott Ford property to develop a museum around midwifery. The Scott Ford family is the story of Mary Scott, who was born a slave in Vicksburg. She came to Jackson and worked as a maid. While working, she overheard white folks talking about buying and selling property. And so she asked them how she could do it. And they helped her buy the land right down there on Cohee Street. Those homes stayed in their family for over 100 years, debt-free. Mary Scott, John and Virginia Scott Ford, and later Lula Ford became homeowners. And they also became middle class because Virginia was not only a midwife, but she became a teacher at Smith Robertson School, the first African American public school in Jackson. Mary Scott was one of the first missionaries at Mount Ham Baptist Church. And this is just one of the families that lived in the Ferris Street area. Booker T. Washington said, "Put down your bucket where you are. Farm the land, build businesses." That's how we survived. And I think that the story needs to be told to our children by example. Mrs. Ruth Weir is the oldest granddaughter of the midwife. One day, we hope to supplement educational experiences through gardening, old-fashioned wash days, and STEM activities. It will answer the questions of the children who long to visit the homes of ordinary people who look like them. And greetings and welcome. Can you hear me? No. You want me to speak louder? Okay, I can speak louder. But seeing that video just really took me back a long ways, because I don't think I can do any better in terms of summarizing what I am about. This is a continuation of what we started to do in those days. So I'll be speaking primarily about notes that we have taken based on the Kellogg Foundation funding of a product which is to be a learning knowledge product. It is to be a museum exhibition. And I spoke with our exhibit developer just yesterday, and he said that in order to come up with what you want in the quality, it's going to take a little more time. We were hoping to get it opened first in December and then March, and now it's a little more time. And I said, I'm sure that Kellogg and everybody else would be pleased, because the primary audience they want us to attract in terms of this long history, some complicated concepts even for us to understand. They want children to be able to understand at an early age. So that's going to take some time, and I'm about over that. I'm not going to cry anymore about not having it on time, because actually we didn't have all the money that was needed. He says that's the other thing. It's going to cost a lot more to produce those video kiosks so that children can touch and go back than it is for them to just walk in and look at pictures and walk out. So that's what we are working for. So if you have questions about the video, that's the most comprehensive, because I want to talk about an African tradition, perhaps, the griot. So we start this, and I'll try to read some of it, with the scene of an African griot. And let me just read it, because then I'll find myself repeating. And the first scene that we want to have shown is basically a drum scene, but the scene is of a 1619 boat newly landing in Jamestown, Virginia, with Africans who were sold as indentured servants for their labor on tobacco farms. Historic times moved fast with every beat of the griot's drums. He says, I came from a line of ancient storytellers about battles won and battles lost, of granny midwives helping to replenish the human life as they had done since the beginning of human history. Now come the time when the Virginia tobacco plantation owner purchased me and my labor, and the granny midwife and the baby that she had saved before the baby's mother jumped into the Atlantic Ocean. These persons and their descendants stayed in the general area of Virginia for about 200 years as their families multiplied many, many times with the help of the granny midwives. During those years, the English colonies, including Virginia, passed slave codes and laws that made us Africans and our descendants slaves for life. As enslaved Africans, we were not permitted to freely travel to and from different communities, especially not out of the Virginia colony. When the tobacco lands and fertility of them was all used up, among the enslaved people sold to Mississippi were the predecessors of the Scott Ford House, currently located on Cohee Street in Jackson, Mississippi. And that's why we put those pictures over there, but you've seen better pictures in the video of the houses. I've forgotten how clear they were. Earlier, they had purchased, okay, so I just said that. The most important prize among the plantation slaves were the granny midwives, who saved the people during birth and sickness. She and with her knowledge of herbs and plants, healed enslaved and the enslavers. Now, I must end this 200-year tale about plantation life when cotton was king. But before I go, I must let you know that the lives of the granny midwives and all enslaved Africans were changed forever in meaningful ways during and after the Civil War. And just briefly, first the Africans became sharecroppers after the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. Second, the 14th Amendment, as you know, gave them citizenship to become Americans as citizens. And then third, the 15th Amendment granted them the right to vote. So I say bye-bye as the African griot. And the way we are developing the exhibit is that each one of the geographical areas, and I don't know if we have the brochures that I could talk about. We didn't get them. We tried to get the maps of the areas that we're looking at. And that would give you a clear picture of how the project is developing. But we start with Natchez, which is the Laos Hills. What my understanding is that probably was where they first settled. And we have collected at least 3 to 4 interviews of people who have memories. And the memories are collected in this way. It's not that they are their actual memories, but they are stories that are passed down from generation to generation. And I am surprised how many stories we have that were actually passed down. We have about 40 different stories. And what I discovered as I read them, none of the memories or the stories that are being told go back beyond sharecropping. And I guess you could understand that. My family doesn't go back that far in terms of the memories that anybody recalls. So that's why we had to have the griot telling about those events, because it's just not a part of the memory that people have. So I wanted, so the after the Laos Hills is the Jackson area, the Jackson Prairie. That's where we're located. And then it's the Black Belt up in North Mississippi. And surprisingly, the latest one is the Greenwood area, called the actual Black Belt. If you ever get a chance to look at those newsletters, and I don't know if we will, I guess we could send them out at some point, you could have a better idea of how we are approaching this study. So let me move on then, because I had planned for that to really take up a lot of time. You know, I discovered that even with my students or the people with whom I'm working, they have very little understanding of sharecropping. How many of you understand what sharecropping was all about and how it worked? There are a few. But let me go ahead and read this part that I chose from one of the narrators, Mrs. Sarah Chambliss. Sharecropping was the main means of supporting the family's finances. A lot of times, the former enslaved people had to get goods and services on credit until the cotton was ginned at the end of the season. If they broke even, they wouldn't get any money for the next year. So again, they would have to borrow money from the plantation owner for food, supplies, and so forth. So it was a vicious circle because many of the narratives felt that actually they were cheated because they never broke, no matter how they saved and worked, sharecropping was not good for them. But it is the system that replaced slavery. And I think that was probably better than being a slave for life, because that first 200 years or so, there was no real opportunity. There were, however, and rather than reading that, I'll just tell you that there were a number of blacks who did own land. They either not necessarily inherited it, but was bequeathed it from their former owners. So we'll move on. I'll just mention that there were a number of opportunities for women to have their babies, but I'm not going to dwell on that. I simply wanted to mention that there were a number of black doctors during this period of time. And Jackson State's campus was one of the places that women could go and have their babies if they had a doctor around at that time to help them out. And I think one of the most warming things for me in terms of the granny midwives, to hear the stories that they really were like the doctors. They were the policemen, the whatever that people needed in the neighborhoods, and this is what they recall. One family, relations with her, one midwife's relationships went like this. We would visit Granny, and she made hoe cakes. And she would be cooking the bread, and we would smell it and all, and then she would pinch off a little bit and give us some. And, well, all loving grandmother. We all loved grandmother. We were going to the Pocahontas to pick cotton and make some money. It would be up to a bale. I don't know how they would pick that much cotton, but that's what it said. At 12 o'clock, the rolling store would ring the bell, and we picked out what we wanted, and our granddaddy paid for it. I thought that was a loving touch there. These are children that do not live on the plantation. They may have come from the little town to earn some extra money. I can identify with that because I once did that. The truck would come by the house, hollering all, and we begged to go. We didn't have a McDonald's or, the places you go to now. So it was exciting to me to go to the cotton field, pick cotton, and earn my own money. And this is what she says here. Sometimes Granny, and our granddaddy paid for everything. Anyway, sometimes Granny would be so happy that we were all there in the field, and she would just start praising the Lord. And so we just looked at her. She was a Christian-hearted woman who always tried to teach us to do the right thing. And then they go on and on talking about this grandmother who was the midwife. One of our efforts is to identify the midwife and all of her various efforts, how she related to them. And then there was along several pages of discussing how the grandmother taught the young black girls to take care of themselves. Some of the things I put in here, but I chose to just talk about the beautification of black girls, African girls. And so this lady says she used the charcoal thing. I inserted the charcoal furnace, to keep the straightening comb hot. Madam C.J. Walker didn't have anything on them. I mean, some of you can probably identify with this, but my grandchildren, they can't identify with that at all. So Anyway, she told me to be careful so as not to burn my kitchen. I'm glad you're smiling, because when I first read it, I read it as burn up the kitchen in the house. But for those of you who don't know, they call this part back here the kitchen. So anyway, I really had to laugh about that, because I should be able to still identify with the kitchen. And then she talks about a lot of things, but then she told the girls that they had to wash their hair in coconut oil, shampoo, and she insisted that when they finished, they had to brush their hair 300 times. I don't know what kind of hair they had, but I know brushing my hair after I wash it, I don't put any, I don't use the chemicals and all. A hard brushing 300 times, that would be difficult. But anyway, I could go on, but I wanted to save some time for you to ask questions. Many of you might have a lot of questions that you want to deal with, and I am really involved with this project and excited about it. And one other thing that I need to say is that we will not be able to put all of the oral history interviews and that information in the exhibit. But we have a relationship with Jackson State University that we have had since I retired, and that is to store our oral history projects there. So in future years, you'll be able to read the whole context at Jackson State University. And we have a similar kind of relationship with the Smith Robertson Museum and Cultural Center, so that artifacts that are given to us are accepted at the Smith Robertson Museum and Cultural Center. And they have a lot of artifacts there that will be a part of the exhibit. So with that, I'll take questions.
If anyone has a question, you can raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone to you.
Dr. Harrison,
Yes, ma'am.
I am in awe of you. Some people may not know your history, but it's very pertinent that you are here today, considering yesterday was the publication of the 1619 Project. And I think you are one of the godmothers of Nicole Hannah, what's her name, Jones. What does the Scott Ford Project center on? Does it center on the families, or does it center on the midwifery that was done by the families, by the women?
Yes. I hope that we can share that newsletter with the people who came, maybe through mail or whatever.
I think we've got copies being made now.
Oh, they're being made, okay.
I hope we'll have some shortly.
The reason why I say that is because we talk about that a little bit. No, what was your question? Let me get it right.
What does the Scott Ford Project
Scott.
center on? Is
The-
it on the families, or is it on the midwifery that the women were involved?
We want to do both. This particular project will talk about midwifery as practiced by the midwife who lived there in the house, and how she served in Jackson. Mount Ham Church was one of the, well, they were all very religious, but she attended Mount Ham Church, and her mother was a mother of the church. And all of the transcriptions that I have read talk about the religious aspects of the Granny Midwives. This exhibit, when it is no longer at the Smith Robertson Museum, will be central to the interpretation of 136. And that's the first house that was built. That's where the grandmother lived and built the houses, her house. And she encouraged her daughter to do the same thing. That's 138. What we want to make 138 into is a historic house so that it would be interpreted for the period probably up to, 1940s maybe. And by the way, we do have a project going on there now to keep it from falling down, actually. And a part of that came from the Mississippi Heritage Trust. And then there are the grounds that have to be interpreted. The wash house, because that's how the midwife earned some of her living, and her mother as well. And then we have the chicken yard and chicken coop. Chicken coop is very visible, not necessarily in those photographs, but it is visible. And we have the gardens there. And in the spring, onions at least come up. You know, those onions will grow almost forever, it seems, but they come up. But that's our task, is to interpret the property in the best, that's what Archives and History is almost forcing us to do, in the best historical manner possible. Because we, like the video was saying, we have very little left in the area. And the Scottford houses are the only houses in Mississippi listed for the midwife houses that have the integrity of the original structure. And we work with WHT architects, and they are very adamant about that. When the houses were first listed, I think about 1895, I get my dates kind of mixed up sometime, but it's around 1895, those architects were involved. And we received a national grant that actually restored 136. And as time went on, and Sylvia Stewart was the person, and that's what this brochure will show you. She's deceased. She made sure that everything was kept in Archives and History as well. The records are at Archives and History. So the architects have been with the project all this time, and they're leading us in terms of a historic interpretation. Yeah, no. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Harrison. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm from Natchez, Mississippi, and you mentioned that there was some recordings, early recordings in the Natchez area. Can you speak a little bit more on that, please?
What I'm speaking about particularly is that Kellogg gave us money to do at least 4 interviews in each of the 4 areas. And we have 3 of those interviews took place in Natchez, persons who are living today and their memories. Early on, we had heard a lot of information about there being a granny midwife house there. But I think 6 or 7 years ago, the house was burnt down. I don't know if any of you know about that house, but they were trying to save it, but as has happened with many of those older structures, they go by the wayside. But we do have those 3 interviews that will be available to the public in about 2 or 3 years, but they'll be at the Margaret Walker Alexander Research Center, because these houses, they're just very small, and even if we had them restored, we wouldn't have the space for people to come in and use the documents. But that's our arrangement with the Margaret Walker Center at Jackson State. Does that help? Yes. Okay, thank you.
Is your project associated with the 1619 project?
No. This is a separate project. We had been trying to get some money to do an interpretive exhibit And Kellogg bit. We're trying to wait right now for them to give us the rest of the money we need for the exhibition.
And yet the first thing that you read talked about the year 1619 when the slaves came over. Was that
Right.
coincidental?
That's just coincidental. Came out of my brain. Well, not necessarily my brain, you know, but I'm a historian, and I always try to help people to understand that, well, Africans didn't necessarily come over as slaves, and not all of them actually worked as indentured servants. It's just that I had so much space, so I was running through what I thought were the most important dates there, and that is when the colonies, one after the other, codified the fact that Africans were going to be enslaved in perpetuity. And there was no end in sight, and that was why all of the hoopla, you know, one of the things with the civil rights, the civil rights war and all, there was a lot of discussion about that. And that's what's taken me so long, because I've got this, I I can't tell all of those stories, but the most important story is that the laws were codified. And the other thing, and I will say this is one of the things I left off though, is that the Africans didn't have any place to run. They were easy. They were good workers too, because they came from an agricultural base in Africa. So there are many reasons, and they knew things that the colonists didn't know. Anyway, you know, that's another story. But 200 years around 200 years is a long time, you know, to be acculturated in that kind of culture. And it's only been, about 50 or 60 years since the end of slavery. And I could go on my soapbox and say we as Americans haven't done enough to erase 200 years, you know. So, okay.
I would like to ask, I heard you talk about the houses, but do you have any interviews of women who were actually midwives, and do you have any interviews of women who actually gave birth to their children by a midwife?
There are some interviews, yes, with older women who actually were midwives, and we do have some. I couldn't identify who they are at the moment. But we'd be happy to, you know, if you were to call the office, they got the back of that brochure, so call and we may be able to identify some for you if that's your real interest there. Okay, yes, ma'am, sir. Please. I'm doing fine. Madam?
They were saying earlier when I walked in that it's just so much that you could know about you. And I don't know if you know that Dr. Harrison is the co-founder of Smith Robertson Museum and Cultural Center. And not only that, just so many organizations, so much work that she did as far as the research for Smith Robertson Museum and Cultural Center, and creating the Margaret Walker Alexander Center. That was her. So just want to say that because she's also one of my mentors, and she knows that I love her to death. And the work that she's done with the Scott Ford House is amazing. If you have not seen it, you should drive over and look at that property. And I just look forward to seeing it manifest to what you wanted to be. Miss Ware, who was one of the last family members of Scott Ford, has passed on at I think 98 or 99, somewhere like that.
Her picture is on that front
Okay,
page.
well, very
That's
good.
why I wanted to
Very
you to
good.
have it.
Yes, it's on the back there. Yeah, but she said she wanted this to happen, and Dr. Harrison is making that happen. So thank you for everything, and you know I'm always here for you.
All right. Y'all heard her say that, right? Thank you so much. But I was talking to one of my sons the other day, and they said, well, Mom, it sounds like you're just going to spend all of your money. I don't have that much, I'm a retired teacher, on this project. And I said, well, ever since I was a child, I can remember sitting on the front porch wondering where we came from, why the situations were as they were, why we walked to Brandon School from out of Pine Valley Church. I experienced this, white kids spitting at us, throwing things out the bus, and we were told by our parents, you're going to school, leave it alone. And so that's what we grew up, doing. But it impacted me in such a way that I care a lot about us being able to interpret it so that our children will know. And you saw where Malcolm was there on that was in D.C. But that's bred in my soul, and I hope that somebody will come along and let me give it to them, because I think my grandchildren need me too. Okay, are there other questions? Because I can go on and on, as you know.
Well, I've got a comment to make first, and then I'll ask the question. My son, who is now 38 years old, was born at home and delivered by a certified nurse midwife. My grandson was born last June. My daughter-in-law had obtained services from a doula, and then she was concerned about going to the hospital in June of last year with all the COVID stuff going on, so she brought in a certified nurse midwife and delivered my grandson at home. So I now have a son and a grandson, both home births. But my question is, doulas, were the midwives of old, were they more like a doula because they didn't have medical, did they have medical training? No. Your midwives today have medical training.
Some of them do.
Yeah, well, they used to have a midwifery school here at the University of Mississippi Medical Center, and they shut it down. That's where my midwife had come from California to train to be a certified nurse midwife here. But anyway, I was just curious about the difference between a doula and a midwife in the old days.
Well, somebody might have more information than I do. You want to answer that? You don't want to? His question.
But it just so happens that I was the original recruiter for certified nurse midwives when the University of Mississippi Medical Center organized the Southeastern Regional Nurse Midwifery Education Program. And Marie McGlynn, she may have been one of those persons that you're speaking of now, was one of those original people who came to the University of Mississippi Medical Center. But my first plane ride came as the result of recruiting nurses to become certified nurse midwives. So I appreciate that. But I did know granny midwives. My great-grandmother was a granny midwife. But I remember more about her being grandmother than being the midwife. Mm-hmm. And she indeed had us to brush our hair 300 strokes.
Really?
And we had to wash our hair with coconut oil shampoo. Mm-hmm. I was probably out of college before I realized that you could use some other kind of shampoo. You did not have to have coconut oil. But I do remember that people came to my great-grandmother and made arrangements for her to deliver their babies. Some men offered a shoat for her. We'll grow it. By the time the baby is ready to come, we will kill your hog, bleed it, cut it up, do all of those things that people did in the country.
That was payment.
That was their payment. Mm-hmm. And I remember that somebody gave her a big spool of cheese, hoop cheese. She loved hoop cheese, and that would be the payment. And there were other things. Nobody had money, so they always made these arrangements. But I don't remember her as a midwife as much at home as she was our great grandmother who made tea cakes and who heated up that cheese and spreaded it on ginger snaps, and we thought that was the best thing in the world.
Wonderful.
So I thank God for granny midwives and for nurse midwives too. There's still some in Jackson. Dr. Frida Bush, who ultimately became an MD in gynecology, I recruited her to Mississippi. She loved Mississippi. She's retired recently, but we are all benefiting from nurse midwives and granny midwives as well. Thank God for our history.
Yes, I just wanted to add to that the numbers of midwives who are not seeking medical training is increasing because what I'm reading is if you understand the body, it's been going on since the beginning of human history, I understand, and all cultures, you know, it's how dumb I was, only it was a black thing. No, all cultures have granny midwives. They don't call them granny midwives, but they have women who, it seems like a natural act for them to have that potentiality of being the midwife in the family or in the culture. So we have a lot to learn. But I wanted to cite one other thing and you'll get this later, and I'll just simply say that up to about 1983, the state of Mississippi was certifying midwives. And then it just dropped off almost completely. And in recent years, I understand that the number of midwives without medical training is increasing. And one other thing, and then I'll get to the question. I have 2 children, and it was just a stroke of whatever that my last child was not delivered by a midwife at the University of Kansas. The baby came too early, that's why. But if I had it to do over again, I would follow the instructions of a midwife. It's basically, I think, scientific. It's just not been written about as much as others. And I'll stop. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
You mentioned that the state of Mississippi did certify midwives. Do you know at what point the state became involved originally in that certification, and was there any training that also went along with that?
Yes. The 1920s. There was a lot of negative press about what was happening with the midwives. And I understand we probably had about 3,000 midwives in the state. They only began to certify and certified about 400 in the early 20s. And I'm skipping a lot here. And the training was very intense and regulated, and people felt good about that training of those midwives. And if you didn't have a certificate from the state for a number of years, it was illegal for a midwife to perform the birth process if they knew about it. So does that answer your questions? Because I'll go on and on, I'm sorry. Okay.
Here.
Okay. I'm sorry I'm so long-winded, but you know, we did the Mississippi Committee for the Humanities funded a project where we had some plaques developed, and I started to bring those, and I thought, well, that was a little overdoing it. But go ahead, ma'am. I'm sorry.
This is a crazy question. I'm kind of embarrassed to ask it, but how come you don't ever hear about granddaddy midwives?
Actually, the men did have a role in all of this. And their role, number one, was to get the midwife to the woman who needed her. And also, they apparently were not allowed in the rooms, but if maybe like a hot towels or whatever was needed that they could provide, they did. And one of the respondents indicated that their job was to find the pay for the midwife. And many of them did, and some didn't. Often, the midwife may have had a fee like $5 or $500, I doubt, but that was not received. And then when you look at the total history starting before the Civil War, the granny midwife was put on a pedestal by the plantation owners. Guess why? She increased his property. And if somebody got sick, that's the person they called on. The granny midwives were very important. But after, and I have to get off of that and move on, after the Civil War, they were of no value to the plantation as such, or the state. And most stories will indicate that they became midwives because God told them that that was what they were supposed to do. And I do believe that there are women who tend to have a certain knack for these kinds of things because it's been around since the beginning of human history. Who helped the women, during this process? And I know they must have needed it, unless the baby just came forth, which probably rarely happened. And so men were the, supporters outside of that process. I don't know if there are men now who want to be midwives. Any men? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
The lady's question prompted me to think of something I thought about recently. There were probably no granddaddy midwives because at one point there was such a thing as modesty, and men didn't know a lot about lady parts. So, no.
You're right. Yes. In fact, in most stories, they were kept out of the room, or they didn't want to come. And one story, the children asked where the baby came from, and the father said, in the shoebox. And let me just finish this part. That the granny midwife, in one story, always carried a black bag, and she always watched it. And so this one set of children were going to see if they could see what was in the bag. And I don't know how that ended up, but because when the granny midwife came, she always brought something like a black bag there. And so maybe the babies came. This is children's mind. One of the things that I'm going to talk about in the exhibit is thoughts that children had about where the babies came from. Now my daughter-in-law wants her children to know everything from beginning to end, and don't you go there. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
As a nursing student at UMC in the 60s, I had the good fortune to see the retirement at the health department of a nurse midwife. I mean, she was not a nurse, she was a midwife that was licensed by the state of Mississippi. And I had the good fortune to see the retirement of this lady. And it was marvelous. This was a calling. Mm-hmm. We talk about calling of ministers and other people, but it was such an eye-opening experience for me And it is something that I have carried with me forever, to see this group of ladies in their white, all of them dressed in white, and they came and retired this nurse midwife or this granny midwife or whatever. But
Should be a
it
nurse
was
midwife.
a really uplifting experience looking at what it had meant to the lives of this lady and the people around her.
Yeah, one of the persons featured on that front of that page, I don't know what your sheet looks like, Minta Usadima. She was a nurse midwife, trained medically. But people would call her a granny midwife, but she said no. She wanted people to understand the difference here. And for African Americans, there's a period of time when there were no or very few African Americans who were nurse midwives. And we have some interviews on that as well. Okay.
I thank you for your time here today. My father and his brothers and sisters were all born at home, out in the country, would be outside Flora. And there were 7 children in all, but they were all born at home, and they must have had a midwife or someone to help with the birth. But I don't really know much about that.
Well,
Obviously, we were white, not so, but it could have been very easily.
right. There were a number of midwives who delivered for white families. One of our judges here in the city, we have a whole bunch of interviews from her family. And I think she even names the family in the interview, a white family that she delivered all of their babies. And the whites today, said yes. We haven't been able to interview them, but the judge said that's the case. So we have not a lot of documentation of African American midwives delivering, and if they did, do they own up to it? But I think we have the certificate, birth certificate, indicating who delivered the babies, the white families. So in time, if we keep pursuing this, we'll have the records to indicate what happened. So we won't have to guess about it.
Dr. Harrison, for folks who are interested in keeping up with this project and supporting this project, how can they do that? Is there contact information on the
I
sheets
think
that we have?
it is on the flyer. I don't have a copy of it. Is it on there? It is. It is, yes. Because the challenge is not only that we have collected these, but getting them processed and getting this exhibit produced in a manner that it's going to be relatively easy to do it for adults, but for children, so that they understand and begin to appreciate something about the past. And the other thing that Kellogg was very interested in is what's called systemic racism. And the little things that I cited was the reason why we don't have many books on African Americans, certainly not midwives, in the Jackson Public Library. They did a study. They don't have any. And then the built environment was the other thing. That was something that I knew I could do. But when the Kellogg saw the budget, out of all the things on the budget, they went to the information, the kiosks, so that children would have access to the information. And, if you have a long script and just pages of pictures and so forth, they'll look, but they keep going. But if they can push something, And they learn from these activities. So that's our struggle now, is to raise the money we have to have, $125,000 to do the whole thing. Kellogg's going to give us 50. I know they are. It's just a matter of time. So that's our real need. If you have a foundation that's willing to buy into this, we are willing to accept it. And thank you so much for being a good audience.
Thank you all for being here today. Remember the open house this weekend, the Christmas by Candlelight tour, and then we'll be back for our last History's Lunch of the season with Robert Kayat on December the 8th. Thank you again. Help me thank Dr. Alferdteen Harrison for this program today.
Thank you. Thank you all. I appreciate you too.